having been in the church, churches don't say this, but this is how they operate. It's like we talk about loving our enemies, but it's this general thing. Until the enemy is really someone who would be construed as a liberal or conservative, depending on what, part of the spectrum you come from. And then suddenly there is no the love your enemies. You are now my enemy, and therefore you need to be eliminated. And even in churches, this happens all the time. People go into enemy mode, and churches don't want to talk about it. They walk around and they say, praise the Lord. And they think, oh, if you can, Jesus is great. And yet the pastor is angry at everyone on his staff, and he's manipulating every single one of them. And I've seen this at churches.
Mm-hmm. Very common.
But even as you mentioned in the book, pastors are some of the most reluctant embracers of understanding or even acknowledging that there's an enemy mode. Why is that?
Well, I think the simplest way of tying all this together is saying that the brain is extremely sensitive to status indicators. And so the pastors that are having trouble, the people who are fighting enemy mode, are all people who have to protect their status, which again, as you pointed out, in an honor society, for example, honor is limited. And so status goes with honor. And, to think about this in a maybe a different way, at the time that the New Testament was written, the highest status a human being could achieve was to be a demigod. So demigods had a father who was a god and a mother who was a human. And if you were a demigod, you had a father who was God and a mother who was human. You had the highest status a human being could have. It was a sort of bulletproof status. And into that context, we have Jesus coming in, who by strange coincidence has a father who's God and a mother who's human. And this is official demigod status. Now, if you have status that is bulletproof, no one can lower it for you. But what you can offer to other people would be to raise their status. Now, the brain notices somebody else's status in about 40 milliseconds, and it takes 3 times that long to figure out what their gender is under the best of conditions. So it's much more sensitive to status than it is to gender. And of course, gender is causing all kinds of trouble figuring out what it is in our culture currently. But to our brains, it's a relatively trivial consideration compared to status. And so you'll find that the gender fight has really become a status fight. Because status is what status do you give me because of my choice of gender or sexual preference and something like that. You see, if you look at the fight, it's now primarily about who gets status and who doesn't, and under what conditions. Again, human beings are wired to have the status fight. So the way that enemy mode works is that I win by lowering your status. But the way that Jesus went about it is I win by raising your status, because if you understood who you could be, you would also be a child of God. You could have human parents and a divine parent as well. And so the way out of enemy mode is to see in other people what would really give them bulletproof status. That is, to be children of God. And Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, because they shall be called the children of God. It's not just, you get this title, but actually you're operating like somebody who says, yeah, I'll give you the highest status possible, and that'll produce peace for us right here. And that's supposedly pastors and churches and all the rest are supposed to be about that business of raising the status of others. And the funny thing about it is, if you're raising other people's status, you can either raise the status of their as if self, which is another little thing we talk about in the book, that is my image. And again, Dallas Willard thought there was few things that corrupted the church worse than image management. And so if I'm trying to raise the status of your image, now, in that case, I could do with the Hollywood thing, and we'll fluff your podcast as being the most influential thing in in the nation and probably the world. And if anybody really understood how important all of that was, then I'd be very important because I'm on your podcast and that sort of stuff. And you would fluff
I'm the
me as
important
big.
one
Yes,
because
of
you're
course.
on my podcast.
Yeah, right. And we would fluff each other and we'd try to raise each other's status here as, and then anybody who passed on this podcast would be a high status individual. And we would establish ourselves as the ones who should be listened to by the world.
Mhm.
But that's a puffing your artificial self. If who Travis was meant to be, the reason why God thought at this time in history, I really want to have Travis Michael Fleming talking to people, because I put something in him that, if it is seen by others, is going to help them understand why I created the world. That is your true status. And it may or may not be liked by other people. But if I draw that out of you, you'll think to yourself, wow, I don't know, that was somehow that interview touched me. It was like an important thing to me right there. And that is the kind of status that'll last 500 years from now. In eternity, when we look back at each other, we'll smile at that moment, at that influence having come out. And if that's what we're about, that's what transcends enemy mode. We're actually building in each other, encouraging one another to be something more than we could have been otherwise, except for this transcendent experience. And that is always our least harmful alternative, to bring out who you were actually meant to be. And when I do that, I raise your status, and it makes me feel like, yeah, that's who I was meant to be as well. Makes my status, in a sense, bulletproof, whether people like it or not. It's hard to put it into words, but I see Jesus doing this all the time. When he goes to talk to the woman at the well, he's correcting his disciples. We're always talking about who's got the highest status among them. I mean, but he says the real status here comes from becoming the person God meant you to be. And even though you're all going to deny me, I'm going to call you back to be who you were meant to be after that, even that loss of identity has occurred. So these are themes are really embedded in who we're supposed to be as people who are getting to know God.